some of us from very far away. I know for myself, I am based in the States, Los Angeles, and I'm just now getting used to being on Singapore time. And I'm flying back to the States tomorrow, so that will happen. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about is for Freddie. We were talking earlier about your experiences just now in Saudi Arabia, traveling quite far away to speak about your own organization's brand. And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So just a few hours ago, I was in Saudi Arabia, had the chance to work with an organization called Glowworks, which really promotes young girls and their opportunity to get education and find jobs in the workplace. One of the things that I was telling Raul from Unilever that I discovered that's fascinating is a lot of these girls actually end up staying in school as long as they can, and they're prolonging their studies because when they're students, it's really the only opportunity they have to do what they want and to be free. As you know, in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive, they're not allowed to leave the home. So it was a really interesting moment. I think one of those insights and those aha opportunities, I think, for brands to think about how to capitalize on that moment in life of an audience, certainly during this whole time of graduation. And they are pursuing multiple PhDs, by the way, because they're really trying to push back that time where they have to get out of school. I think a big opportunity for brands to do a lot of educational work, but also target them during those years when they're really sort of getting educated and making up their minds. And when they're more of a captive audience in terms of thinking about the world. So that was definitely a very eye-opening moment and a reminder that brands always need to be really in touch with their audience and seeking those moments of opening to talk to people.
Thanks. Yeah. And Vijay, why don't you tell us a little bit about how your company works with startups to promote the brand and to find new opportunities for defining the brand?
Absolutely. I mean, we all know that the world around us is changing, and therefore we do need to change in terms of the way we engage with our consumers. And Phil McKinney once said, when it comes to innovation, an ounce of experimentation is worth more than a ton of theory. Yeah, and clearly, we do want to move into a zone of experimentation because every day that an idea stays on a PowerPoint file, it withers, it shrivels, and ultimately it dies. On the contrary, piloting is something which is really like oxygen to ideas. It helps to bring the ideas to life, helps to grow it, helps to give it shape. So therefore, we are really trying to move away from plan and perfect to launch and learn. And in order to enable us as a big company to do that, we've launched the Unilever Foundry, which is a platform which has got broadly three objectives. One is it provides an entry point for tech startups to engage with an organization like ours. The other is to help to stimulate and facilitate experimentation within our organization. And the third is to really build and cultivate strategic partners for the future. So really what it is, it provides a platform for collaboration between our brands and with tech startups who could help us to connect with brands and address challenges that we face today. And it provides a framework for experimentation. And what we do is we also provide the startups with mentoring as appropriate.
Thanks. And Raj, one of the things I'm curious about that we're discussing is the use of big data and analytics to understand who your audience is and who your customer base is and how that can shape brand perception and give new insights you couldn't find through traditional methods. Can you talk a little bit?
When we look at brands these days, what we're finding is that in the past where brands had very, very long life cycles, those life cycles are actually shrinking. So call it 20, 30 years ago, when a brand like Nokia launched, they would have thought they would have been around a long time and they were a mega brand when they were big. But now look at the Nokia brand today. The reason why that's declining is it's not meeting consumer needs anymore. And what big data is allowing us to do is actually stay on top of consumer needs. And consumers as a whole are generally ahead of both marketers and ahead of brands. And the ability to keep up with them is going to be crucial for brands to stay relevant. A big part of that is also because of the democratization in the way that people can actually access brands. So in the past, you can control a channel outlet if you're an FMCG in terms of you can only get my product X within this channel because that's where they sell soft drinks, for example. But these days, those channel opportunities expanding so massively, and using data to actually find those opportunities and find them in the time in which consumers need them is going to become increasingly important for those brands to stay relevant. So the ability to harness that, and back to one of your first points in terms of the smartphone, because of how connected the smartphone is, the ability to harness that data is going to be increasingly important for brands to actually stay relevant, to stay on top of what they're doing to extend that life cycle.
Thanks. And one thing I'm curious about for our audience, I know a lot of folks here have small companies or even dreaming about starting startups and building brand identities of their own, getting customers to think of their software, their platform, their product as something different than the competition. And for all three of you, what advice do you have for actually starting to build a brand when you're at step one and just getting your organization started?
Well, maybe perhaps just to build on what you said, I think that back in the days, the folks were probably gone away and have a big brainstorm with each other and figure out, what is the brand, and, sort of come out of that session with a roadmap and a brand idea, et cetera. I think the opportunity now, specifically for startup, is you can use a lot of collaborative tools, and they're free, such as Twitter. You can mine the billions of conversations that are out there to really harness that big data for free. All it takes is really your time and a couple of apps and tools, and understand what that market demand is out there, and build your brand with the intelligence of that big data rather than build it based on what your own thoughts are. So I think the process of building a business and building a brand is very, very different today. And you see the resulting campaigns that come from that are also a lot more big data baked. Giving the example of just what Unilever did with the Speakeasy campaign. Absolutely amazing. Unilever looked at the millions of conversations that women were having around beauty and their bodies, et cetera, and mined that big data to come up with a campaign that was fundamentally a reflection of those conversations. And they, put a hashtag against it, which was #Speakeasy, and they ran a campaign, which is essentially just a mirror back to the conversations and the big data that was out there. So I think that the collaborative brand building model and that use of big data, that's absolutely essential for how businesses need to be thinking about building up their businesses today.
I think if I was going to give some advice to a small company or a startup, it's really understand what role your product plays for a consumer. So if you are a true innovator in the marketplace, and I'm going to give you an example of WhatsApp. When WhatsApp started, there's been no marketing, no advertising around that product, but it has actually built real brand utility for consumers. That brand utility built up, consumer engagement built up, and they sold for some ridiculous amount of money to Facebook, although it'll probably end up looking like one of Facebook's best investments. If I look at another brand in the IM space, now that WhatsApp's in place, if I'm now a brand building a similar messaging service, I'm now competing with this behemoth of WhatsApp. So the way in which I now need to look at my brand and how I build that brand's in a very, very different environment to what WhatsApp built in. So you need to look at what your product is, what the utility it's providing to consumers, and then what the competitive landscape is in which you're trying to build something to actually determine how you build that brand, and whether paid media is needed to do that, whether owned media can be used to do that, whether you use earned media as the function to do that. And I think those different contexts are going to actually determine which way you actually do launch your brand, especially in today's world where you don't necessarily need paid media to do the job if you have the right product and you have the right type of network to distribute either the product or the service that you're trying to put out there.
Yeah, I think I just build on that to say that it's really important to understand what is the need of the consumer and where does your technology or your brand and product fit into the lives of consumers, and how can it therefore help the brands to create a relationship with their consumers moving forward. And that's really the role that startups can really help to play.
And let me shake it up a bit. What is the biggest branding don't for startups that each of you can think of?
Well, one that I can think of don't is not a me too, because if it's already there, then why would you? What's new that you're bringing to the table is something that you should always be asking.
Yeah, a lot of startups who I see, especially ones in Southeast Asia, are building a better widget, and that better widget isn't necessarily that much better. And when it's all good for the market, so if I'm building something in Indonesia specific for an Indonesian audience, then that can fit a role within Indonesia. It's when they go, okay, now I've got global aspirations, but what they've built is specific to that audience or that segment. And then they're trying to take it out further than that, where there are better things that sit elsewhere. I think the desire to expand at such speed into areas that you just don't know is the big watch out that I'd have for them, especially for their brand.
I agree. I think the way I would put it is don't do it just because you can. I think it was Jeff Bezos from Amazon who said, you know, what you need to do with technology is fundamentally put it aside, identify what the human need, put the technology on top, and see if it helps that human need. So don't do it just because you can. An example, I think there was a toilet company that ran a campaign on a big digital platform, and they were investing very heavily to try to collect some fans and writing all sorts of things to get people to like them. Who's going to like a toilet company? It makes no sense. On the other hand, there was an app that was built that helped mothers identify clean bathrooms around them so that they would be able to find a changing table, etc. That is useful. So don't do something just because you can. Do something because it really makes sense and it fulfills a human need. And it's really not how it's done, but why you're doing it in the first place.
And how do you translate your brand when you're entering a new marketplace? I know for Twitter, even though it's globally available for the start, it began as a very US-centric service in terms of its user base. And when you're going from Silicon Valley techies and media folks in New York being the prime audience to attracting users in East Asia, Middle East, Africa, you name it, how do you translate the experience to these new users?
Well, what's interesting is, in many ways, we just follow the needs of our users. So when I said, don't do it just because you can, I think that we've been very true to that. What's interesting is at its inception, Twitter's only 9 years old. There was already a bit of a conflict between, Jack Dorsey, who wanted it to be a messaging service, really to sort of give instant updates on your own personal status, versus some of the other founders who wanted it to be more about the world. So there was always this healthy tension between what am I doing versus what is the world up to. And what we see today is that tension at the source of the platform has stayed true, and you have some of our users who are using it to share the status about their life, which we call my world. And as we've opened the platform to more countries and are evangelizing in more countries, certainly in the Middle East and in Africa and Southeast Asia countries, we see a lot of users using it less to talk about their own status, but about what's happening in the world. So that tension between my world and the world is very much there. And as Twitter expands, what we're trying to do is to make both of those things available. So if there is a global event, everybody can share in communion. For instance, the World Cup, millions and millions of tweets, they can share what's happening in the world, but at the same time, they can also share what's happening in their own world, in their own language, something that can be extremely specific to their own culture and their moment in time. And that happens, in a real life format. And that's what's so interesting is the tension between those two things and why, the platform is continuing to be adopted around the world.
I also think that where you've got a brand that's actually delivering on a real consumer need as you're going across borders, and I'm going to pick out a brand like Netflix right now. Netflix doesn't exist in this market, but I'm going to guess most people in this audience know what Netflix is. And where it is serving that need for a consumer is, again, because of the way the world's connected these days, because Twitter's a global platform, because Facebook's a global platform, and forgive me if you're from China, because I know access to those platforms aren't as easy there, but this is propelling these brands to actually build out even before they get into market. And again, because you've got, Netflix just launched in Australia. It launched with 69% awareness, having never been in the market, having never spent a cent in that market. It is picking up share very, very rapidly because there was a desire and a want for an OTT service down there that was being withheld by the market, which has actually propelled that brand in a very meaningful way there. And if you get back to that consumer need and actually looking at what consumers want, you can often have a brand being built without spending anything within that market.
And we have a question for the audience here. Are brands for life still appropriate, or should agility and relevance be more of a priority?
That's a great question, I think, and challenge to what you were saying.
Brands for life, I think, people will give you examples of how they exist. I think that at the moment, if you keep your brand relevant, it can be for life, but a brand that exists in the same state that it was 10 years ago won't exist today in that state. So if you look at the Interbrand top brand list, the number 3 brand there, like number 1 and 2 were Google and Apple. I think it was Apple, then Google. Number 3 was Coke, and if you actually read what Coke did to stay in that position, they acknowledged the ability to stay the number 3 most valuable brand in the world, down to innovation. Some of it being Marcom innovation from things like the Share a Coke campaign, some of it being product innovation in terms of launching new Coke products, and a lot of it being actually distribution innovation. And when you go and read the report, there's just line after line of the innovation that they're driving, which is all very consumer-centric to actually stay relevant as a brand. So even though we think of Coke as just this bottle of black soda that is there, it's innovation that they acknowledge and that also the Interbrand study acknowledges that is keeping them relevant and keeping them as a brand for life. The minute that innovation drops off, they'll be in no better shape than a Kodak or a Nokia or these types of brands.
I think that's fair. There's some data from Gartner that shows that 30% of the most powerful brands that will make it to that top percentage are not yet identified. So whilst I agree, I think at the same time, further to the point that you made earlier, I think that the velocity that we're going to see around brands will continue to accelerate. Again, if you look at brands like Twitter, we're not even a decade old, and to a lot of the market already, we feel pretty established. So I'd say there's a big cycle of new companies that we don't know about that is coming, and it'll probably be more a matter of semantics, brands for life, meaning brands that are relevant in your life rather than endure your entire life.
That works. And one thing kind of going from there, question a lot of people in the audience are really interested in apparently, what are effective ways to establish brand identity within communities that just got access to smartphones but aren't really tech savvy in terms of knowing how to use social media or other aspects of the internet?
Well, I mean, we've had experience of building brands where consumers have not had access to even smartphones. So, I mean, if you take Knorr as an example, and as we expanded rapidly into Asian markets and African markets, one of the challenges was how do you connect with consumers digitally where all that they have is a basic feature phone. And we actually partnered with a startup called Digital Genius, who basically what they have is artificial intelligence combined with NLP. And the question that they were trying to answer is, what is for dinner tonight? And we created something called a Chef Wendy, where essentially consumers could text in what were the ingredients that they had at home on that evening, and they would get back recipes as to what they could cook. And using this, what Knorr was able to do was not just to reach consumers who were potentially media dark, but also to establish relationships with those consumers. So there are ways and means of establishing a relationship with consumers who are not necessarily tech savvy, even consumers who have very basic feature phones.
It also seems like that means modifying your brand a little bit. I'm thinking the example of Wikipedia and Facebook reaching out to the sub-Saharan African audience who are still using these super, super old cell phones that don't run Android, older platforms. You're just talking about being able to play Snake on it, maybe Tetris if you're lucky, and that's it.
I think that's right, yeah. You have to just I think it's all about the content. You have to think about the content that people want and then just make it available less expensive. For instance, as Twitter, we just acquired a company called ZipDial in India, and we partnered with the government. We realized that people wanted a lot of emergency services, and in India, they just don't have enough broadband. It's either too expensive or it doesn't work. So what we did in acquiring ZipDial is we're making that available through free SMSs. So it's about identifying what the content was that people wanted and then finding alternative solutions to get it to them. They don't care in the end if they never log into the Twitter app and it just gets sent to them in an SMS. As long as the information is there, they're happy, and that solidifies the relationship. Yeah.
And another kind of startup-y question for the audience, the most effective way to build branding without investing heavily. So how do you get to eat your cake without having to spend any money on it? How do we do this?
I think a lot of that depends on, when you're looking at your brand, identifying what the task that's needed is a really critical thing. A lot of brands I've worked with have gone down the path of going, oh, I don't want to spend any money, and there's this thing called YouTube out there, so let me just make bits of content, and I'm sure that's going to go viral, and then everything will be good, and I won't have spent a lot. Unfortunately, that's just not the way it works. What you need to look at again is, fundamentally advertising has always been entertainment. So if you go back to the 60s and 50s, 1950s and 60s, soap operas were funded by soap companies, and it was entertainment. Advertising now, because of the amount of clutter, is less entertaining, but when you see entertaining advertising, you will still share it, you will still watch it, it still is relevant to you. So again, I know I'm really harping on this consumer-centric point, but when you start to create things that are consumer-centric in whatever format that is, the necessity to pay to actually push your message out there becomes less important, and your owned and earned media will work a lot harder. But again, if you as a brand want to build very quick reach because you have a certain objective to do that, then understand that you're going to have to pay for that, because you are going to have to use mediums, at least today, such as television, to do that.
Yeah, and I think what we see is, in terms of learnings from the technology sector, is a lot of technology firms have really concentrated on developing those kick-ass services, and they haven't so much worried about the brand aspect, right? They're delivering a utility first and foremost, and then when it's of great service, people share it. You know, Twitter hasn't invested a cent in consumer marketing. It's the users that have made the brand what it is. You talked about WhatsApp, that's a great example. So I'd first focus on what is the benefit of the service before worrying about marketing the brand, because the users can take care of that. And there are many examples. Even you look at Xiaomi, which is just kicking it. They're not investing nearly 1% of what Samsung is, and people are recognizing, and those conversations are carrying the brand forward.
And continuing the whole brand building on a low budget question, how has YouTube and internet video in general changed the game, just in terms of being able to build a video aesthetic for brands and reaching out to customers globally when you're just still a small company in just one corner of the world?
I think the interesting thing in YouTube right now, apart from the brands, as in companies and products we know, is the brands that have been built through the YouTube influencers. I think those YouTube influencers, and you brought up the Everything Hair campaign from Unilever. I think it was actually the use of people, the YouTube influencers such as Bethany Moda, who Unilever used to actually push that out, that actually affected back onto the brand. So YouTube is now developing within these influencers quite powerful brand identities, that if you can actually leverage your brand the right way with these influencers, can actually push out certain messaging and positioning that you want your brand to be associated with, which can be very, very positive. When you get that wrong, you really get that wrong, and you totally discredit where your brand is. And again, I think that Unilever All Things Hair example is just one of the best examples I've seen without overtly pushing a brand in the messaging.
I think what's interesting is also to think of YouTube not as another television channel, but around the idea of video in general, and how video is completely changed the way that that kids think about the world. I mean, the primary search vehicle for millennials is YouTube. So it's not just a, sort of an alternative TV channel. It's really an alternative education channel. So thinking about video as an asset to really engage in those conversations with your audience, and making educational pieces available to them, because that's, now kids, they self-teach themselves anything, how to learn their guitar, how to use your product. So thinking about video as a different kind of asset than you would have of television, I think that's really the opportunity. And then creating that into different video series, and really engaging on a more educational basis with video. Really, really different way of thinking about that asset.
Right. Yeah. And Vijay, someone in the audience wants to know, what does success look like for a platform like the Unilever Foundry?
So for us, the Unilever Foundry, as I said, provides a platform for collaboration between our brands and startups The way it works is that we put out pitches, which essentially outlines the problems that our brands face. We invite proposals from startups. We then evaluate those startups. And then, depending on the technical capabilities, et cetera, we would award a pilot to a particular startup. So for instance, we've just launched the Unilever Foundry here in Singapore, and we had 3 briefs out from Lifebuoy, Lux, and Clear. Very clear briefs outlining what the requirements from the brands are, therefore what are the technologies areas that we're looking at. And whoever wins those pitches, we would put down $50,000 to do a pilot with them. And depending on how it goes, we then look to scale it up. As I said, we provide mentoring to those startups as we go through the pilots.
And the foundry here in Singapore, the company is primarily Singaporean or from throughout the region, or?
So the foundry is global. The briefs are put up on the FS6 site, and therefore anybody from around the world could pitch for it. Singaporean companies are more than welcome, but if there are companies outside of Singapore, they're also welcome to pitch for that. Depending on, if you think you have the right technology, then you can pitch for it.
And for these smaller companies who are located all over the world, who are trying to reach typical audiences, know here in Singapore, we're talking a lot about Singapore being the entryway into the Asian market for companies in Europe, North America to reach China, Japan, South Korea. When you have limited resources and you want to build connections with large corporations to reach the Asian market, how do you do that again on limited budgets when you just want to quickly accelerate and get your small startup noticed in Asia? How do you do that? Easy question.
So I guess the principle is we start small, learn quickly, and then scale rapidly. And that's why we start with a pilot in response to a very specific brief that we get from the brands. Learn, and then once it works, then you look to scale it up rapidly.
Great. And for everybody, I'm curious, at your organization, what was the most surprising brand lesson that you've learned in your career?
What's the question?
The most surprising lesson about your brand that you learned in your career that went against what you were expecting it to be?
For me, one of the most enlightening reads I've had recently was a book called How Brands Grow. Quite enlightening because it dispels a lot of advertising and marketing myths. Things like where a lot of us sit there and we've been quoting numbers like Pareto's law in terms of 80% of your business comes from 20% of your client base, but for actually most FMCGs, that's not true. Another myth is that your most valuable customer is your loyal customer. Again, that's not true when you actually go back and you harness the data that's come out of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And I think a lot of those learnings actually were quite surprising when they have been published back through Ehrenberg Bass, because a lot of these marketing and advertising myths have been built for 50 years. And when you look at the hard data, because marketing science is actually a relatively new thing, they've been absolutely dismissed.
Yeah, I think the book from Byron Sharp was really quite eye-opening because, as I said, quite a few things that we've learned through our careers in marketing have been built around myths around building brand loyalty, but it clearly demonstrates how big brands are bigger, not because they have higher loyalties, but because they have a higher user base. Therefore, the entire shift around get more users. And yes, he does talk about a leaky bucket, but ultimately it's about getting more users, not getting the same users to buy more. And that changes the way you look at advertising, your promotional strategy, etc. So it was quite an eye-opening book, that from Byron Sharp.
I mean, the other thing for me is, so I've been working in this industry for 15 years. I think 15 years ago, if I was a brand manager in Unilever, I knew that if I could put out a certain amount of GRPs on television, I was guaranteed to fairly give or take the results I'd get back in my sales. These days, there's no guarantee of that anymore, and I think that's making it a lot harder for big brands to actually figure out the certainty in their marketing and brand investment. It's also why I think a lot of bigger brands are starting to turn to startups and to innovation, because this is the way to actually increase engagement. And the really important thing for the startups in this is to understand how they can actually help those big brands. And things like the Unilever Foundry, I think, excellent, but not all big brands actually have these startup setups in place. But there are other places to go, like Startup for Brands in the US, like Pollenizer in Southeast Asia, where the startups can get themselves in front of big brands at the relevant time with the relevant product based on those briefs, like the Clear or Lux brief.
And let me ask another instructional question. If you could recommend any book to audience, to these small startups on marketing, just kind of let them know how the hell to do it, basically, what would you tell them to read?
I would say start with How Brands Grow. I mean, it's the first real book that starts to use data out of marketing to set some rules into place. It will give you a good starting position to how to grow your brand.
Perfect. Any recommendations?
Yeah, I'm thinking through all of my marketing literature. I mean, to be honest, I think that a lot of what we learned in MBA school is no longer relevant. I mean, to be honest, a lot of these books are great and they're foundational and it teaches you the 4 Ps and things like that, but I think the best thing that you can do as a startup today is really take your customer conversations and use that as your fundamental base for what you're going to do, rather than some book, which was probably, by the way, written by a Westerner and doesn't apply to Asia today. That's the other thing, is I think that the marketing literature on the market has not really kept pace with the fundamental changes that we see. 60% of all millennials are going to be coming from this region. 51% of all social media users, 48% of all mobile users. And yet, if you look at the percentage of marketing literature that's been written by people from here, it doesn't compare to what you see coming from the US. So I'd say a lot of those manuals, I would read them. I would say really just go on the best practices of a startup. And I love what you said. It's interesting that bigger companies are taking a lot of the attributes of technology, like beta culture, fail fast, test, pilot, and go. Do those kinds of things. That's your marketing vernacular for today. Really listen to that big data and your customer pipe. That's what I would do. I don't think a lot of the marketing literature really applies today.
So it sounds like there's a real blind spot in the marketing literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that, a lot of the, I do quite a bit of teaching at some of the schools here at INSEAD and ESSEC and all those schools. They're just reinventing the program. I mean, a lot of the books that we relied on, they haven't kept pace, and they don't teach you a lot of these principles that you actually see great companies like Unilever take on, and the beta culture that tech companies. So I wouldn't rely on those to give you kind of any guidance, and even some of the basic principles like your placement, your pricing. I don't think a lot of that applies nowadays. So I wouldn't take it from the literature.
And I have 2 questions to the audience here. They're getting a lot of votes, apparently. I'm going to ask them both at once, just make it more fun. When should you rebrand? And what does your brand do to be consumer-centric? So either one, go for it.
Could you repeat the second question?
Absolutely. What does your brand do to be consumer-centric?
Well, I could talk about one example to answer the second question. So, for instance, we have a little more than 3 million ice cream cabinets around the world. And imagine, there's a Magnum in every one of those cabinets. What can we do to get those magnets, those cabinets, to actually talk to consumers, and therefore use them as communication vehicles beyond just using them as retail stores? And that was one of the challenges that the team had, and therefore they actually worked with a startup called Newper, which essentially has a proximity platform, and they use iBeacon technology to really find an ice cream cabinet which is close to a consumer and helps the consumer to find other friends of his or hers who are close by each other, so that it does 2 things. It gets consumers and close to their friends, and helps them to find an ice cream cabinet where they can all get together and enjoy an ice cream. Yeah? And that's one way in which you create engagement between consumers and the brand using technology.
Yeah, I think being consumer-centric is not saying you're going to do it, but actually going to do it. And it's always funny when you see, on the walls of some companies, they have a mission statement, and they all have, we're consumer-centric or customer-centric or whatever. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of it's really just about listening. And now you can listen at scale with a lot of the platforms that are out there. Twitter being one of them, but there are many others. You can mine those billions of tweets and for free understand what's going on. So I think you really, really have to listen to what consumers want. Examples for us as a platform, when the Japan earthquake hit, we had millions of tweets that came in and people saying, we want Twitter to provide an alert system. We consequently changed our platform to provide that service. So it's really getting that feedback and actioning it, whatever your service or product is about. In Australia, we received feedback that it would be great to provide Twitter alerts to surfers when there are sharks in the water. So we worked with the Australian government and their environmental services to tag sharks, and the technology chip that's in the shark reports back on Twitter. So in real time, when you're looking at your feed, you can see if there are a lot of sharks in the water, which if you're a surfer is quite useful because it could prevent you getting a bad nip. So I think really listening to what your customers want out of your brand, out of your product is essential. It's not just putting it on a mission statement, but doing it for real. And I think along with that is also being a lot more local in the expression of your brand and service. So it's not just deploying something at scale and hoping that it works for everybody. Really localizing the service, country by country, culture by culture. That's also, I think, a very important success factor for today's companies, today's brands.
My one advice to anyone trying to be consumer-centric is not just the volume of data or doing research, it's really understanding what's behind that. And quite often people look at data or look at research at a superficial level, look at the observations and go, okay, I'm going to do something because of that. So I'm going to pose a question. Before the iPhone came out, who knew that they wanted an iPhone? Who knew that they wanted that functionality in a phone? They knew what they wanted out of a device, but they didn't know that's what they wanted. And it's actually understanding the why, the motivations, how to get behind it, which quite often isn't just coming in that data feed. And that's where you need the expertise to understand that. You need people who work in that insight space, who can actually interpret that at a local level, I agree. But just looking at that data stream quite often can lead you astray. So it's understanding the why behind the what. To the first question, which I don't think any of us have answered in terms of when someone should rebrand, my one bit of advice again there is don't be so quick to throw away what you've already built. I think quite often brands go, I just need a refresh, I'm going to rebrand, which quite often ends up in not a good place for them. So don't do that very, very lightly because you spent a lot of time, money building equity in what you have built. And to just throw that away can be not a very good thing for you.
Yeah, when that question was asked, I just kept thinking to myself, don't do it. Meaning, really, if you're thinking about rebranding, perhaps that's not the issue. Or maybe it's already too late, quite frankly. So I would go back to the service and the user experience more so than thinking about rebranding. Because unfortunately, I think when Nokia starts to ask those questions, it's already toast time.
Perfect. And with that, it looks like it's time for the next panel. Everyone, thank you so much for taking time to speak. Even better.
Oh.
I like that. I like that very much. So the next thing we're curious about, now that we've been given that state of execution, is when you're talking about building your brand through smartphones, through YouTube, through internet video, you're reaching this very specific audience, this not all young, but definitely a younger skewing demographic. And when you're entering these new markets with your organization, how do you make sure your brand is recognized by everyone and not just younger users who are glued to their phones and are seems to me at least the first demographic to really notice new organizations, new companies coming in?
So for me, I think the fallacy around the smartphone is that it's only young people on there. That's just not true. Smartphone adoption is actually affecting audiences all over the place. I think what's happening in terms of the fragmentation of media and the ability to use data to micro-target audiences means that the message that you're delivering to specific audiences can get tailored to increase the propensity to respond or to engage. I think what's happening these days is the old days of the congregation around one point in time when that final episode of MASH is going on, so I'm getting 70 million viewers there and I push out a mass message, that is declining. Linear television is declining. So overall viewing of television actually hasn't declined. It's just the linear television has declined over time. What's happening with smartphones, with YouTube, is the ability to use data as an overlay on that to know who I'm talking to and to actually feed a specific message to that person because I can understand them better based on past behavior or based on other pieces of information that I have there. And that will become more than the tailoring of the message to that person as opposed to, and going after those discrete audiences with those discrete messages that I know will work better to them rather than just having one message to one mass audience.
Yeah, and to build on that, I mean, we have data that shows that the average consumer unlocks their phone 110 times a day. So, I mean, 110 times a day, a brand has an opportunity to make it into, you know, the emotional conversation that, you know, when they unlock the phone. So I think just to build on that, what's different with mobile is the pervasiveness of that relationship. You know, people touch that phone before they have breakfast, before they kiss their partner, before they take off their jammies. So it's a much stronger relationship, which means that, you know, you can target people at much greater significant day parts that are a lot more targeted based on what you want to tell them. And also serving up that content on the go means that you have to think very differently about what it is that you're distributing, because it has to be shorter format, very engaging, it has to be great for on the go. You know, the experience of that content needs to be different. So, and then finally is the location aspect, being able to target people based on location, on the fact that, you know, their mobile data is sending out signals. That's also huge in terms of all of the e-commerce opportunities. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that, location-based services. There's been a lot of talk, but, you know, it's not still very well optimized. You know, the four squares and you know, it hasn't really sort of delivered yet.
I think the other thing for me, and this only came to my mind yesterday when I was listening to the head of Vodafone's head of innovation, don't assume that what you're looking at as the mobile today will be what it is in 5 years' time. And he was very clear that in his point of view and Vodafone's point of view, the mobile phone as we know it today will not be what it is in 5 years. It'll be something very different and we can't conceive what that is yet, despite Freddie thinking it's going to be her watch.
Who knows, right? Yeah.
And a question for the audience for Vijay is, how much does Unilever spend each year through the Foundry?
Oh, Rahul, do you have a number for that?
We don't disclose.
So we don't get the good information.
But we've been doing quite a few projects. So it's an order in several projects, numbers in the range of 50 odd projects which have already been done and substantial. Maybe you just want to repeat that because
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've done significant number of projects, upwards of 50 projects through the Foundry, and each of them is a significant investment. So significant amount of investments have gone through the Foundry.
And for the Foundry, so we see the benefits of for the startups, but on your company's ends, what are the benefits of this program?
Well, as I said, you know, for us, what it gives us is an opportunity to do things differently because the world around us is changing, and therefore the way we engage with consumers needs to change. And what startups bring is new technology that enables us to engage with consumers in a different manner. So therefore, it is absolutely important from our end that we do things differently, and that's where startups help us.
And I gotta say, I have never had so many audience questions in my life. They're actually good ones as today. So everyone, thank you. We've got a question here that I'm gonna wrap up with. What if you're a brand in a reluctant market? You mentioned listening to consumers, but what if consumers don't actually have a need for your product? How do you market and build your brand in that case?
I would recommend that you probably look for a new market. If consumers fundamentally
product.
don't want your product,
New market or new product, take your pick.
it's one of those things that brands that have no consumer utility are going to die. I'm sorry, they will. In the old days, they used to say that if you do something good for someone, they'll tell 10 people. If you do something bad, they'll tell 100 people. Today, with Twitter and Facebook, you do something good, they'll tell their network. You do something bad, watch how many people find out and watch out how quickly that happens. And for any of you who want a case study on this, look at the United Airlines where they broke a guy's guitar and what he did.
Unfortunately, negative sentiment travels at a higher velocity than positive. That's a fact. But perhaps what the question is about is, what do you do when your brand is not yet well known and there isn't enough conversation for you to use for insights? Maybe that's what the question is about. I mean, I think thinking about the age-old seeding strategy is a good way to go. Looking at a very limited set of core users or influencers or bloggers and seeding your product to generate some good insights and good conversations would be the way, I think, to go. Again, within the spirit of Foundry, like go small, pilot, learn, beta, and then advance. I think 10 great conversations with a product that's being seeded is better than trying to go at scale and then no one's giving you any feedback at all. So that'd be my advice.
Perfect. Everyone, thank you so much. You've been great. Have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.